Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. I'm your host, Rick Landgraf. I'm joined by two guests today on this special episode of Horns of a Dilemma. My first guest is Jane Vaneman. Jane is an assistant professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Jane, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
My next guest is Tristan Volpe. Tristan is an assistant professor in the Defense Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School and a non-resident fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Tristan, welcome.
It's great to be here.
Jane and Tristan are the co-authors of Dual Use Deception: How Technology Shapes Cooperation in International Relations, which was published in the journal International Organization, Volume 77, Number 3, in summer of 2023. And this study won International Organization's 2023 Robert O. Keohane Award for Best Research Article published by an untenured scholar. So first off, Jane and Tristan, congratulations on this honor.
Thank you.
Okay, let's dive right into the discussion here today. Tristan, and let's begin with you. Can you please summarize the argument of the article for those who haven't read it?
Sure. So I think at the broadest level, what we're trying to do in this piece is examine the relationship between technology and international cooperation. In particular, we're trying to think about a specific set of attributes that seem to really be quite vexing when it comes to crafting formal arms control agreements that try to limit or control military weapon systems. And that's the dual-use nature of technology. Now, there's two main reasons why we kind of think about the dual-use nature of technology and why it's so important. The first, from just a substantive perspective, if you think about a lot of modern technologies, they increasingly seem to be quite dual-use in terms of that overlap between military and civilian applications. Think about space systems or biotechnology, right? These are really critical technologies at the crux of great power competition today. And they're fueling, in many ways, kind of economic competition between the US and China, for example. But there's also a lot of potential military applications. And so one way to try to maybe curtail some of the most dangerous or kind of unnecessarily expensive applications is to maybe control some of those weapon systems with a formal arms control agreement. The challenge here is that this has proven to be quite difficult for technologies like biotech and space systems, because efforts to try to limit those weapons applications often mean you have to kind of also institute similar controls on the civilian side. And this has proven to be quite difficult. So from a Southerner perspective, we're trying to understand, okay, how is it that this kind of dual-use feature of modern technology, which seems to be increasingly prevalent, whether it's cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, what role is it playing here? But then from more of a research perspective, that is, there's a real puzzle, which is that we've actually crafted arms control agreements that are verifiable over a lot of dual-use technologies. Just because it's hard over space, cyber, AI today, doesn't mean that it hasn't been possible. In fact, nuclear technology, we have a formal arms control agreement. That's verified with the International Atomic Energy Agency. We have the, controls over chemical weapons, right? And the list goes on. So this is a real puzzle that we set out to try to understand. How does the dual-use nature of technology potentially enable or block efforts to craft arms control agreements? Okay, so what's the argument? What do we look at? We really try to break down this concept of dual use. Thinking of it in terms of binary, like a technology is either dual use or it's not, it doesn't really get you very far, right? We try to think about two specific attributes of technology that could be applied to basically any weapon system. First is what we call distinguishability. This is basically like how easy or difficult is it to differentiate the military from the civilian applications. So just to give you a kind of concrete example, think maritime. It's pretty intuitive to differentiate a warship from a commercial cargo container, right? The physical attributes are very distinct in terms of armor and the way they're designed. They're produced in very different ways. They're often deployed in very different patterns at sea. And the ability to convert a commercial cargo container into an operational military vessel, it's very challenging, right? compare the relative distinguishability of maritime tech with the nuclear fuel cycle. You have uranium gas centrifuges, for example, spinning in commercial applications to produce fuel for light water reactors. They're virtually identical to those spinning in Natanz in Iran, right? That have potential military applications, right? So the indistinguishability of nuclear technology is kind of potentially a major challenge. The second attribute that we focus on is integration, right? This is like, how deeply entwined is this technology in military and economic realms? Again, to kind of come back to the nuclear example, this is a really significant technology, but it doesn't actually have many uses beyond producing electricity or fissile material that goes in the core of a nuclear weapon, right? Compare that with drones, highly integrated into the civilian economy now for things like agriculture or other sensing applications, and also used in a wide variety of applications on the battlefield in Ukraine, right? This is a highly integrated technology, very similar to space systems, right? As a technology becomes more integrated, it becomes increasingly challenging for states to really try to accept intrusive verification or inspections over a technology, primarily because the security risks associated with doing so are difficult to contain, right? One reason why states have accepted verification over nuclear technology, for example, is because those security risks of espionage are relatively contained to the four corners of a nuclear program because it's niche. It's not ubiquitous. And kind of looking back at the negotiation record, one reason why arms control negotiations failed over non-nuclear ASAT, anti-satellite weapons in the Cold War, is precisely because U.S. officials really struggled to figure out how they would contain the counterintelligence risks just to what was being verified. Okay, so that's the basic kind of attributes we're looking at: distinguishability, integration. And what we do is combine those attributes to really identify a series of information challenges that states are going to need to face and grapple with in some way if they want to have a formal arms control agreement. Now, the article kind of visualizes these as a 2x2. So since we're kind of in a audio format, I'm not going to attempt to kind of do that, but there are these four basic zones that technologies fall into, and some of them are easy to deal with, in which the dual use nature of technology doesn't play a major role. Think highly distinguishable technology that's not integrated, like nuclear tipped ICBMs, long range missiles, right? Negotiators faced a lot of challenges during the Cold War negotiating arms control agreements over this technology, but the dual use nature of technology is not one of them. Compare that with technology that's highly indistinguishable and highly integrated. Again, a lot of those technologies I was mentioning at the outset: biotech, space systems, cyber, AI frontier models, right? These all fall in what we term a dead zone for arms control, precisely because you need a lot of information to be able to verify compliance, make that first order determination about, is the activity or technology that I'm observing, is this for military purposes, or is this kind of a benign civilian activity? You need a lot of information to make the determination. And unfortunately, that might go beyond what states can collect with their own, national intelligence services. And the problem is that you start getting into intrusive inspections that become necessary. That's not going to be possible because the espionage risks, the security risks are so high. So that's the kind of basic argument. And I'll turn it over to Jane to talk a little bit about how we try to kind of investigate this empirically.
Great. Thank you, Tristan. So one of the things that we do in the paper is we use intuitions from sort of a few examples and use other sort of theory to build these predictions and these hypotheses. But then what we really wanted to do is test the hypothesis and really analyze these ideas across a wide range of technologies and data. We didn't want to just kind of pick a couple of cases. We wanted, and what we do in the article is look at the full case universe, the full set of technologies available to states. So in doing this project, initially, we kind of started out thinking about, all right, great, we'll find a list of military technologies out there on the internet. And we reviewed a number of different kinds of technology lists. But often the ones that existed, they would kind of serve a specific policy purpose, like being a critical technology for a particular competition, or answer some specific other kind of research question. And so for us, existing lists had a lot of drawbacks for our purposes, and they didn't answer that simple question of what are the main weapons technologies that can be categorized at a sort of decently kind of high level. So we made our own list that is we seek is kind of to be relatively simple, but is nonetheless exhaustive. What I'll just say is that if you ever want somebody to raise their hand in a presentation and challenge something you're saying, go ahead and assert that there are technology categories. And invariably, there's somebody out there who knows like a little bit too much about like World War II navies in the audience, and they will have some concerns about the categories. But I think sort of having gotten a lot of feedback from a lot of different people and worked with a number of subject area experts in designing these categories, I think we've ended up at a pretty useful and interesting place of case studies. So what we do in the paper is there's 35 case studies of individual technologies where we categorize them along these attributes of dual use technology that Tristan just talked about, distinguishability and integration. And we assess whether the kinds of patterns of cooperation, arms control, or lack of it actually bear out in the data. And our findings show pretty strong support for our theory. We see arms control agreements coming about that were not plagued by some dual use issues, and other cases where negotiations fail or even are not even started because the technology is too indistinguishable and highly integrated. And finally, there's cases where the specific forms of the agreements or the issues that are addressed in the negotiation processes really do try to address exactly the kinds of monitoring and disclosure challenges that our argument predicts would occur. I think sort of as a whole, the way we sort of think about the argument in this piece is that, of course, technology is not the only driver of arms control. Plenty of other variables and factors go into whether agreements happen or don't, or the form that those agreements take. But the nature of technology has been really overlooked. And what this paper seeks to do is identify what the specific contribution of the technology variable is in thinking about international cooperation.
Tristan, back to you now. What motivated you to write this piece at this time?
Let me kind of give a story about the kind of origins of this. It actually stemmed from what I would consider to be a slight professional failure, which was that I was relatively obsessed with this concept of dual use distinguishability, how it could vary. But as a scholar of kind of nuclear politics, I was really only looking at one specific technology. And so I was working on a book about 5 years ago, which just came out last year with Oxford University Press. And at the time, I felt like there was something there with this concept of distinguishability. And I was like, I have to put this in the book manuscript, which really focused on a completely different topic about how states leverage nuclear programs to compel concessions from superpowers. I was like, I have to include this. This needs to go in the manuscript. And so I took a risk of this whole idea in the book. I had a book workshop in 2019, which I considered to be fairly disastrous. This concept didn't work for that version of the book manuscript. And for those who have read my book, they'll know it's not in there at all, really. That was the main kind of feedback I received from very senior scholars was, there's some great stuff in here, but you've got to cut out this distinguishability piece that's just not working. And they're like, shave it off, find something else to do with it. I took that feedback seriously. And at the time, when I was setting out to revise the book, basically around when COVID hit, I was providing some feedback to Jane. She had a revise and resubmit, as we call it in the biz, on a great piece with the political scientist Andrew Ko in an article that would come out in the American Political Science Review that really tried to categorize the key mechanism that ended up in our piece, which is what they call the transparency security trade-off, which is that arms control agreements, they need to provide enough information to be able to detect violations, right? But not so much that they disclose deeper security vulnerabilities. As I was reading this piece, I thought, hey, it seems like this concept of the dual useness of technology, right? Distinguishability, it kind of seems like it might shape that first piece of the mechanism, like how much information is going to be necessary to detect violations. And so that's how Jane and I got linked up, was me trying to kind of salvage the wreckage of this book workshop, take this idea that I really believed in and apply it to a much broader topic, right? It's something that cuts across different technologies. It's not just a nuclear issue. Jane, I don't know if that's how you remember kind of the origins of this project.
So I actually definitely remember you calling me to talk about this and asking me whether I thought dual use distinguishability was like related in some way to the TS trade-off. And we had, in the review process for that article with Andrew, we had gotten excellent comments from reviewers, but one of them had actually specifically asked about dual use technology. And like Andrew and I had pondered this, and in the typical method of academics had been like, yes, this is important. It does affect our dynamic in some way, but we're not going to focus on this in this particular article, and had kind of like left it as a question mark to be studied later on the shelf. So when you called me to ask about it, I was definitely like, yes, I agree. I think it should matter, but I don't know how exactly. And then we just basically spent the next year trying to figure it out.
Tristan, back to you now. What sort of impact has this piece had so far?
This has been a really fun article and publication to brief. There's been interest from academics, but also spent a lot of time briefing the results to folks in the policy community, as well as industry. We spent some time in San Francisco going out to the AI Frontier Model Labs, kind of talking with them. And what's been fascinating about talking to this diverse range of scholars and practitioners is some of the questions and insights that are common amongst all these different communities. And the number one issue that comes up is what to do about technologies that fall in the dead zone for arms control, especially space systems, biotech. I was just in Geneva last week at a side event for the Biological Weapons Convention Working Group, and of course, AI frontier models, right? There's a really big emphasis on, okay, we buy the logic of what you and Professor Vaiman are laying out. It's, in many ways, it's intuitive. It captures a lot of kind of, I think, what folks already know about some of the barriers to arms control. But in identifying some of these specific barriers, we're trying to at least illuminate how high some of these barriers are, and if they're insurmountable, ways to maybe potentially sidestep or get around them, so you're not just kind of banging your head into the wall here. And so that has kind of spurred some thought in terms of follow-on work that we want to consider in terms of if a technology falls into the dead zone. We're not trying to be overly pessimistic here, but it does suggest that a formal arms control agreement, like the ones that we've seen in terms of like, you know, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, SALT, START, etc., like these sort of agreements are just not going to be possible. And that you need to consider, if it's in the national interest, to consider limiting or putting some sort of controls on especially dangerous technology, you're going to need to consider other options, such as maybe trying to limit behaviors, you know, trying to advance norms of appropriate behavior in space, for example, right? And so that's been a really consistent question that we've received. And I think that's really illuminating in terms of folks trying to think through and understand, okay, there's clearly something going on here with the dual useness of technology today, but we feel like our work has helped kind of specify a little bit more what exactly some of those challenges are. Jane, I'll pass it over to you to talk a little bit about some of our conversations with folks in industry in terms of how they're potentially trying to maybe shape some of these characteristics.
A couple of sort of interesting questions that have come up in our discussions that I think have sort of challenged the way Tristan and I are thinking about how do we think about AI as a technology in this context, right? Because on one hand, you could think about AI is kind of as a technology itself that falls in one of these zones or boxes. But another way to think about it that has kind of emerged from some of the conversations that we've had is that kind of not AI as a kind of technology or technology category in and of itself, not a weapon or weapons platform, but rather as something that's more like electricity or the internal combustion engine. It is something that enables fundamental changes or evolutions in other technologies. So then the real question that we should be thinking about is perhaps something like when a particular military technology becomes AI enabled or becomes enabled with AI and how it works, does that affect the extent to which it is distinguishable from civilian applications? Does it affect the extent to which it is or is not integrated with other capabilities? And these things may in turn have effects on cooperation. The other interesting question I'll just mention that has come up is sort of in the process of a technology going through development, whether there are either technical elements or policies that can be enacted or pursued now that would affect its future trajectory of whether it is more or less distinguishable in the future or more or less integrated in the future. Because in the paper, we kind of took that like something that is, right, a technology is or is not distinguishable. But another way to think about it is sort of, okay, well, what can be done to make a technology more or less distinguishable? And that's something that I think is a really fascinating question, particularly for emerging technologies like AI.
And that leads me to our final question today. And we talked a little bit about follow-on work and also areas for future research. Jane, you just mentioned AI, and I know there's a discussion of AI in the conclusion portion of this piece. But for both of you, what advice would you have for other scholars researching the same topic of how technology affects cooperation and specifically arms control agreements? Tristan, let's start with you.
Sure. So to kind of paraphrase David Fincher's classic, The Social Network, drop emerging, just technology. It's cleaner to study, right? Like we don't need to study emerging technologies. I think there's a value in just focusing on attributes of technology that we can characterize going back, in this case, 150 years, right? Just because something's new and it has this emergingness to it doesn't mean we can't study it. So that's the kind of number one point I'd like to leave folks with. I would say in terms of how we're looking at this going forward, in terms of kind of research, I think it's really important to consider the potential trade-offs between arming and arms control here, right? I think kind of this study has led us to, I think, be quite agnostic about, whether arms control is good or bad in any situation. We're just trying to understand how these attributes of different weapon systems, how they kind of create different barriers for on the arms control side, but that might also create opportunities for unique ways of building up military capabilities, right? States are going to try to exploit the dual use nature of technology to practice deception. Is that bad or good for international stability? I think these are open questions, right? And so that's kind of another, I think, very fruitful area for research that scholars might want to consider. How do these technology attributes shape the way that states go about arming? This is a topic that international relations scholars have been obsessed with, but I don't think we have really good answers that cut across different technologies. A lot of what we have really focuses on specific weapon systems. We know a lot about how states pursue nuclear weapons, for example. We know about how states posture those capabilities. And I think that applies for other various weapon systems, but kind of like an overall framework for thinking about technology, how it shapes tensions between arming and arms control, I think could be really useful. And that's my final kind of consideration here, is that I think it's useful to try to consider becoming what I would refer to as like a T-shaped scholar of technology. That is, like, you want to combine probably deep knowledge in a specific technology, that's the vertical bar of the T, with breadth of knowledge about other technologies, right? That's the horizontal bar. So Jane and I started looking at nuclear technology. Jane's work focuses a lot on strategic nuclear forces and arms control. I focused a lot on kind of the nuclear fuel cycle, like how states acquire nuclear weapons and some of the non-proliferation deals that have been cut. That's always going to be our bread and butter. We don't pretend to be experts in space systems or biotech or AI, but our background in nuclear, I think, has set this nice foundation to think about and compare the nuclear technology stack, if you will, with these other technologies. So I would encourage scholars that are just trying to think about how to study technology to maybe try to master an expertise in one, but don't be afraid to try to compare that to others.
I totally agree with Tristan in the sense that I am much more excited by research that looks at sort of attributes or characteristics of technologies, and rather than like any one specific technology, because I'm really interested in sort of differences and similarities in them. And I think sort of adopting an approach that looks across technologies and focuses on attributes, I don't think it's rejecting the idea that there might be something really fundamentally different about today's emerging technologies than in the past. But I think what that kind of approach does is helps scholars focus on what exactly that difference is, right? Like what exactly is so different about some of the technologies we're often writing about and reading about today. And yeah, it's just in kind of reference a new project that we're working on, sort of looking at the flip side of this paper, right? So this paper focused on cooperation arms control. And next we want to really think about how technology affects arming patterns and how states choose to arm with certain technologies and how the nature of the technology affects incentives for arming in particular ways. So we're very excited about that project and sharing it with folks in the near future.
Well, we look forward to your future work. And again, this has been a great discussion today. This has been Jane Vaneman and Tristan Volpe. They are the authors of Dual Use Deception, How Technology Shapes Cooperation in International Relations, which was published back in 2023 in the flagship journal, International Organization. Jane, Tristan, thank you so much for joining us on Horns of Dilemma.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.